Knock, knock. Woo. Oh, don't get too excited. It's just a dad joke. Want another one? Knock, knock. Hutch. Bless you. That might be kind of a minister joke, that one. You got to give dads their due, though. Do you know that Mother's Day was made a national holiday in 1914, but Father's Day did not become one until 1966? More than 50 years later. Well, this was partly because of disappointment that Mother's Day had become really commercialized, and quickly. It had barely been made official when Mother's Day was turned into a big commercial event in the country, and it started to seem like Mother's Day was just all about getting people to buy things. Congress and the public seemed not to want to create another consumeristic holiday, and they could see that the businesses that stood to profit from Father's Day were already front and center in promoting it as a possibility. All the businesses that sold neckties and pipes and things that were likely to become standard gifts in that era, the equivalent of today's beard oil and barbecues. Right? I think beard oil sounds so old-timey, but that is current. That's current now, beard oil. I have bought some for a person with a beard. So resistance to commercialization was one factor, but I suspect that gender roles, gender norms, also had a hand in it. Throughout most of the 20th century, women were expected to inhabit a domestic sphere, and they were not likely to receive public recognition for their work or their accomplishments, even when they achieved things that were of great benefit to the public. Just this week, I read an article about Jean Purdy. She's the woman that co-developed the process of in vitro fertilization. And her two male partners in that endeavor became famous for it, while her name was pretty much immediately forgotten, even after one of those male partners insisted publicly that she had been an equal partner in that work. That was in England, but of course there are lots of examples of that kind of thing here too. In the 20th century, and some would argue that still today, Mother's Day functioned to honor and recognize women in a way that, while the work of mothering is valuable and worthy, it also reinforced stereotypes about womanhood, and it helped to keep women in those domestic roles, in their place, the way we did it. Now, when we are remembering the history of these holidays, if we did not acknowledge the role that race and racism played, that would be a really weird omission. It would be a kind of remembering that is actually a kind of forgetting. Because when Congress spoke of mothers in the early 20th century, that Congress was a Congress of white men, and they were talking about white mothers. Mothers of color were far more likely than white mothers to work outside the home. And their mothering was not generally held up in our country as something sacred. I mean, look at what had just happened. Slavery, children were sold away from mothers of color. There was the genocide of Native American mothers and children, actively encouraged. And look at what was happening, and in fact is still happening, laws that systematically privilege white families and disadvantage families of color. We can look at who is likely to be wealthy and who is not, who can choose to be a stay-at-home parent and who is less likely to be able to do so, who is separated from their children at the border. Right? Meanwhile, fathers did not need a special holiday to function in the same way as Mother's Day because their gender granted them access to work that was already valued and recognized publicly. But fathers who were people of color did not necessarily have the same experience as white fathers. So you can see what I mean about the history of race and these holidays. And if we speak about history as though we're speaking of everybody, when really it's a white perspective on history, then we are reinforcing the idea that white people are the people that matter. So we've just got to be really clear-minded and intentional about the way we talk about those things. American society has this hierarchical structure, and this has had an impact on fatherhood. The gender norm that's taught about men in the mainstream is that men should strive to be on top or as high up as possible in the hierarchy. Make money, be physically strong and big, put down others below you, and race factors in and class factors in. There's really no room for vulnerability in that mainstream traditional American model of masculinity. America and gender have always been diverse, but I'm talking about the dominant model we've seen in this country, where vulnerability in men is seen as weakness, and weakness is seen as feminine. That traditional masculinity disdains femininity, so there's no vulnerability allowed. And because of that, there's not a lot of possibility for true intimacy or closeness, because those things require some vulnerability on the part of the people involved. So traditional American masculinity has been physical, and it has shut down feelings and connection. Several months ago, the American Psychological Association released, for the first time ever, a set of guidelines for therapists working with men and boys. In the past, they've had guidelines for other groups, but not for men, because men, and in particular white men, were considered just the standard human. No special category needed, right? Everybody else was a special category with special guidelines. Oh, geez. Well, now psychologists recognize that men and boys who are socialized to that traditional masculinity, who are pushed into that traditional role with the emphasis on stoicism, aggression, competitiveness, and dominance, actually suffer ill effects from that. Even if they seem to benefit in terms of social power, it costs those men something. The men living in that model live shorter lives. They have poorer health. They are lonelier. I'm going to post a link to this article about those guidelines in the online version of this sermon so that you can take a look if you want to. And they also pay special attention to the intersection of race and traditional masculinity in that article. It's really quite interesting. This sermon is called Beyond Ourselves because the theological theme of this month is transcendence, and I'm going in a different direction than I was thinking when I picked that name 6 weeks ago for the newsletter. But one thing that's true is that the hierarchical masculine model we've been living with in the US, it teaches men a sense of duty and sacrifice, but it has been short on other beyond ourselves kind of thinking. There's not an emphasis on interconnection. It is lonely. It has resulted for many men in unhappiness. I've talked with many men who felt that way, that that model just didn't fit. It left them wanting. The soul doesn't thrive in those conditions. Spirituality does not deepen and mature in those conditions, at least not easily, not without some kind of a crisis that challenges a traditional-minded man's sense of control and autonomy, because that's when you get that vulnerability. And the hierarchical model has undervalued the role and the need for fathers. While mothers are expected to devote all to their children, as a culture we are accustomed to the absence of fathers, either emotional or physical absence. There is, in our shared life in this country, something the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr calls father hunger. He observed it first at the Albuquerque jail, where he was the chaplain for 14 years. He says it was exceedingly rare to see someone in jail who had had a good father. In fact, he says he is not sure he ever met someone in jail who had a good father. And the young men he encountered there, he says they practically worshiped him because they just hadn't had the experience of an older man caring about them and respecting them. But father hunger is not just in jails. All through the population, in every generation, including in our elders, Rohr says, he hears a yearning for a nurturing father energy, for a kind and present masculinity. Rohr is in his 70s, and he says he has seen men older than he is, men in their 80s, weeping with that father hunger still. It doesn't go away. And at the same time we're experiencing father hunger in our culture, we're also experiencing this Me Too movement that has happened. And a movement in support of gender diversity, which we embrace at First Unitarian. So that traditional mainstream masculinity is being challenged and it's being questioned on multiple fronts. And in response, predictably, there is some anxiety in the culture. There is a fear that masculinity itself is under attack. We see articles and news stories and radio shows about this. But masculinity itself does not need to be under attack. A new masculinity should not condemn traditionally masculine traits. It's just that instead of only cheering our boys on for things like physical strength, we should also cheer them on for the strength it takes to love and to ask for help when you need it, to forgive and to seek forgiveness, and the strength it takes to be vulnerable sometimes. A new, well-rounded, healthy, happy masculinity, it would be a whole person masculinity. It would be flexible instead of rigid, understanding that all humans have masculine and feminine traits. It would not be so binary, not so either or, and it would therefore need not be offended when people are not binary in their gender, right? Be more open. And instead of obsessing over being at the top of a hierarchy, a new cultural idea of masculinity could focus on being real, being happy, and being whole. You want to know something that used to drive me crazy when my kids were little? It was when I would go out alone and I would run into someone I know and they would ask me if my husband was home babysitting. Babysitting. As though our kids were a side job for him, like under the table, right? No one ever asked my husband if I was home babysitting, because I was their mother. This is a reflection of what I said earlier about us being accustomed to the absence of fathers. While mothers are expected to devote all their time to their children, we are accustomed to the physical and emotional absence of fathers. So much so that some people use the word for temporary caregiving to describe a father being with his children. Babysitting. A father cannot babysit his own children. You can't babysit something that's yours, right? The writer and the pastor, Aaron Watham, says something similar is going on in our churches when we speak of members as volunteers. And she thinks maybe we shouldn't ask for volunteers at church anymore. Now, this is going to sound tangential for a minute, and you're going to wonder if I've gone rogue. Okay? What does this have to do with Father's Day and hierarchies and a new masculinity? And also, didn't I just let poor Andrea get up here and make a pitch for volunteers for the Family Promise Program? Yes, I know, but stay with me because I'm going to bring it back together in just a second. Aaron Watham was getting ready to write an Easter article, a thank you message to her congregation for everything they did to make the holiday special. She looked around and she saw sparkling windows and floors, finely manicured landscaping, dramatic paraments hung with a complex pulley system by dedicated house elves in the wee hours. I do know some men in our congregation who would love to do this. She says, and then I started thinking about the work of the worship team, the children's ministry team, and musicians, not to mention the greeters, the handshakers, the bulletin hander-outers, the coffee makers, and the youth group out there hiding eggs for the little ones, plus more behind-the-scenes workers I haven't mentioned. It takes a whole village of volunteers to make all of this happen, she typed into her message, but then backspace, backspace, because volunteers seemed like the wrong word for what they did. She says, if you ask a grandparent or an elder of your church, I'm pretty sure they will tell you that the church they grew up in never asked them to volunteer. Historically, the church has asked people to serve as deacons, as greeters, as Sunday school teachers, or on the property committee, and whatever the job was, it was considered a service, a ministry. She recalls that churches only recently started speaking about members as volunteers, and it wasn't 100 or 200 or even 850 member churches like this one that started it. It was mega churches, churches with thousands of members that operate with big corporate kinds of models, moving people through in efficient, systematic ways. Volunteering is something you do at a place that's important to you, Watham says, like a school or a library or a food bank. Volunteering is something you do at a place that's important to you, but not at a place that belongs to you. She says you can't volunteer at your church any more than you can babysit your own kid, because your church belongs to you. So of course you're part of it. That's true in our church too. Our church is no more and no less than what we make it together. It's ours. It's funded by the money we give to it. It is as wise and as compassionate as we are, and it serves when we serve. The church doesn't volunteer when we volunteer. The church serves when we serve. Everything we do is part of that. And it's us. It's us being larger than we would otherwise be, and growing spiritually more than we might otherwise grow, and making a bigger impact, yes, beyond ourselves than we otherwise could, because we're better together. We transcend ourselves by serving. Now, I actually don't think we need to do away with the word volunteer around here. So go ahead and sign up for Family Promise. In truth, you will be serving if you do that. You'll be bringing yourself to something, and you'll be co-creating this church, and it will serve because you serve. It's really about how we see what we do. Volunteering sounds like doing, like task-oriented. And serving, when you're doing a kind of ministry, it's doing, but it's also a way of being, right? When we serve, we bring ourselves to something. And that is something that is good for all of us, and it is something that very much connects with the new kind of masculinity we're seeing in our national conversation. I want to tell you something really cool about men and serving and ministry at First Unitarian, particularly for this Father's Day message. I want to tell you how men have been some of the pillars of our children's program. Men bring nurturing and creativity and a deep sense of service for our children's program. I just sat down the other day and started thinking about, just brainstorming a list of all the men I know who have served in our children's program. Bob, Sterling, James, Tim, Chris, Eric, Vance, Robert, Peter, Doug, the other Chris, the other Doug, Kelsey, David, Bill, Chase, Skip, Patrick, Josh, Clay, Carlos, William, Ian, Andrew, Arnie, Phil, Jeff, Alex. That is not a complete list. Some of them are fathers or grandfathers. Some have no children of their own. But, altogether, their presence brings this beautiful, diverse, caring male energy into our children's lives. Isn't that wonderful? By the way, right now, our children's program is in need of some more people to serve. Last time I checked, only one person had signed up for today. And we need people for future weeks, too. So there is a sign-up sheet at the connections table in the foyer if you are curious about that, or if you know you'd like to serve sometime this summer in the program. And I hope people of all genders will put their names down. Men, all people who identify as men, and fathers, both official and unofficial, are so important at First Unitarian. It's good to be part of a congregation where diverse men are welcomed as whole people and where so many good men love and serve. You want to hear one more knock-knock joke? Knock-knock. Mustache. Must ask you a question, but I'll shave it for later. And now I really have an ethical obligation to step away from the pulpit. So let's sing. Our final hymn is number 298, Wake Now My Senses.